What if an entire civilization was buried? Not just in the ground, but in the history books too. There's a city in Siberia called Irkutsk, and the story written about it in textbooks says one thing, but the buildings, the ground, and the maps say something else entirely. Today, we're going to walk through the physical evidence, the photographs, the old maps, the gaps in the timeline that nobody seems to want to explain. And by the end of this, I think you'll have more questions than answers. And that's exactly the point. For over 150 years, European maps labeled this part of the world as Grand Tartary, not a vague frontier, not empty land, a named territory appearing on maps from dozens of countries across multiple centuries, a place with cities, trade routes, and a level of organization you don't put on a map unless it actually exists. And then, suddenly, it's gone from the record. The name disappears, the history disappears, and what replaces it is a much simpler story, that Siberia was home to scattered nomads, and that Russians arrived in the 1600s to set up small wooden forts for trading fur. That's what we're told. But let's look at what's actually there. If you've never heard of this channel before, welcome. We cover alternative archaeology and forgotten corners of history here. If you find this worth your time, hitting subscribe and leaving a like helps more than you know. Now, back to Irkutsk. The name Irkutsk comes from Irkut. Mainstream sources say it means spinning, referring to the river current, but older linguistic analysis suggests that Irkut in ancient German translates to ray of God. Two completely different meanings, one ordinary, one deeply symbolic. Which is the real one? That question alone is worth sitting with as we move forward. The official founding story says that in 1661, a man named Yakov Pokabov built a small wooden fort at this location, mainly for collecting fur taxes. That's the beginning of Irkutsk, according to standard history. But a mainstream Russian historical website, not a fringe source, an actual academic source, published something surprising. It admitted openly that local chronicles from multiple independent sources consistently reference a prison and settlement at this site in the early 1650s, not 1661, earlier. And then the author of that piece raises something even curious. The island at the mouth of the Irkut River, supposedly where Russians were arriving for the first time, already had a Russified name, not a Buryat name, like almost every other geographical feature in the region. A Russian name, which suggests the Russians were already familiar with this place long before the date they claim to have discovered it. So who was there before, and what did they build? Now look at the photographs of Irkutsk from the 1800s. Not paintings, not illustrations, actual photographs. What you see are grand stone buildings, ornate carved facades, multi-story structures with details that would require skilled craftsmen, significant resources, and organized construction. This does not look like a frontier outpost that started as a wooden fort 60 years earlier. But here's the detail that stops you cold. The streets in those photographs are unpaved, completely muddy. There are no paved roads. Think about what it takes to build a large stone building. You need to transport heavy materials, stone blocks, carved wooden panels, iron fixtures, glass, chandeliers. All of that requires a road. In any era of construction, you lay your road infrastructure before you build, because without it, you cannot move materials to the site. So if these grand buildings were constructed by the people in those photographs, why are the streets still mud? How did they get everything there? On what surface did they haul those materials? One interpretation that has been raised in alternative archaeology circles is that those mud streets don't show something being built, they show something being excavated, dug out. Because the buildings were already there, and the people in the photographs were uncovering them, not constructing them. That would be a dramatic claim, except there is physical evidence in Irkutsk right now that forces you to take it seriously. Walk through certain older sections of the city today and you'll see something that no mainstream historian has ever offered a formal explanation for. Houses that are partially underground. first-floor windows sitting at ground level or below it, structures where the lower portions are simply swallowed by the earth, as if the ground rose around them or they sank into it. This isn't subtle. This is visible to anyone who walks through with their eyes open, and the official record says nothing about it. No landslide, no flood, no geological event. The houses are just there, half buried, and we're supposed to assume that's simply how they were built. But nobody builds a house with the ground floor windows underground. That makes no structural sense. Something happened to that ground. By the look of the architecture and materials, the style of construction dates those buried structures to roughly 120 to 170 years ago, which puts us somewhere in the mid to late 1800s, which is interesting because 1879 is when the Great Fire of Irkutsk occurred. But before we get to that fire, there is one more thing about this ground worth mentioning. In 1908, one of the most mysterious explosions in modern history happened over Siberia, the Tunguska event. Something detonated in the sky with enough force to flatten an estimated 2,000 square kilometers of forest. Trees knocked flat for miles in every direction. The shockwave felt hundreds of kilometers away. Scientists still debate what caused it. Official sources say Irkutsk was not affected. Too far south, they say. The blast zone was hundreds of kilometers to the north. Now here's the part you can check yourself, right now on Google Earth. There is a town called Tunguska located very close to Irkutsk. Not the explosion site, the town. When you try to get directions from Irkutsk to this town using Google Maps, no route comes up. The road doesn't exist. And when you zoom in on the location using satellite view, the town appears to be buried under ice. A town, buried, with no road leading to it, and no official explanation anywhere. Is this connected to the 1908 explosion, or to something that happened even earlier? Nobody seems to be asking that question, at least not officially. In that fire, 3/4 of the city burned. The Governor General's palace, gone. The administrative buildings, gone. The government archives, gone. The library, gone. The museum, gone. Think about what was lost. Every document, every map, every photograph, every written record held in those buildings. All of it destroyed in a single event. And this exact pattern, catastrophic fires in historical city centers in the late 1800s, destroying precisely the kinds of buildings that held records, appears in city after city around the world during this same period. Chicago, Boston, San Francisco, dozens more. Each city emerges from its fire with a cleaner, simpler founding narrative. After Irkutsk's fire, historians say the city was rebuilt at remarkable speed. Electricity in 1896, a theater in 1897, a train station in 1898. Officially, by 1900, the city had earned the nickname the Paris of Siberia. But photographs of Irkutsk's grand architecture that predate the 1879 fire already show us the ornate stone buildings, the grand facades, the developed city center. If those buildings were there before the fire, before the supposed major development period, then who built them and when? There is one map of the region dated to 1700 that gives us a glimpse at what may have existed. Cathedrals, church steeples with large pole-like structures extending from the top, and on the left side of the image, formations that several researchers have described as resembling pyramids. Now, one more thing, and this one is the strangest contradiction of all. When researchers have asked modern AI systems about maps of Grand Tartary that predate 1800, the AI's response has been that those maps are considered mostly fictional because Siberia was not well understood at the time. But the Wikipedia article on Irkutsk itself states that a road connecting Moscow to Irkutsk was completed in 1760, and through this road, Irkutsk was receiving imports from China: gold, diamonds, silk, tea, through an established trade town called Kyakhta, a connection to the Silk Road, a trade network that had operated for centuries. How can a region be so unknown that maps of it were essentially fictional, while simultaneously being integrated into one of the most well-documented international trade systems in human history? The answer to that question probably matters. Then came the Russian Civil War, then the Bolsheviks, who historians acknowledge renamed streets, redrew maps, destroyed records, and rewrote narratives across every territory they controlled. And then in 1937, what history calls the Great Terror, mass executions across Siberia. KGB records from Irkutsk alone estimate 15,000 to 17,000 people killed and buried on the city's outskirts. That burial site wasn't officially acknowledged until 1989. Civil War, Great Fire, demolition, systematic erasure of records, mass killings. If you wanted to make sure a population forgot its own past, you would do exactly those things in exactly that order. So here's where we land. Irkutsk sits in a region that appeared on world maps for over 150 years as part of a vast, named civilization. The official founding story, a small wooden fort in 1661, doesn't explain the grand stone buildings that predate the city's supposed development. It doesn't explain the partially buried structures that stand in plain sight today. It doesn't explain why the unpaved streets that appear in construction-era photographs. And it doesn't explain why an academic source admits that local chronicles place a settlement here a full decade before the official founding date. Maybe all of this has ordinary explanations that simply haven't been documented yet. Maybe there are records somewhere that fill in all these gaps. Maybe the buried houses have a geological cause nobody has studied. Or maybe the buildings are trying to tell us something that the books stopped saying a long time ago. What do you think happened here? Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. If this sparked something, share it with someone who loves history, and go check out the other videos on this channel.